So, Emma, are you still doing that little computer thing? Or have you finally gotten a real job? Victoria's voice cut across the table with the precision of a surgical knife, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that had been my companion for 32 years of family gatherings. I'd walked into Alessandra's, one of the most upscale restaurants in downtown Seattle, exactly 20 minutes ago for my brother Derek's engagement celebration, and it had taken Victoria less than 5 minutes to draw first blood. The private dining room glittered with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, the kind of venue that cost $500 per person minimum, and I sat in my simple black dress and minimal jewelry, while Victoria held court in head-to-toe designer labels that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She smiled at me with that particular expression I'd come to recognize over the 6 months since Derek introduced her to the family, the smile that said she was being friendly, while her eyes cataloged everything about me that fell short of her standards. Emma's always been the creative type, my mother said from across the table, and the way she emphasized creative made it sound like a diagnosis rather than a compliment, something to be pitied rather than celebrated. Not everyone is cut out for the corporate world like Derek and Victoria. My brother sat beside his fiancée, his arm draped possessively across the back of her chair, and when I caught his eye hoping for some intervention or support, he simply shrugged and took another sip of his wine. This was the pattern we'd established over 3 decades. Derek was the golden child, the achiever, the one whose mediocre accomplishments were celebrated like Olympic victories, while I was the disappointment, the one who'd always been just slightly off from what our parents wanted me to be. "I'm still running my business," I said quietly, keeping my voice even and professional, the tone I'd perfected in countless boardrooms and investor meetings, though no one at this table knew anything about those. Victoria exchanged a glance with the two women sitting beside her, friends she'd introduced as Jessica and Amanda, both of whom worked in marketing and tech firms around the city. "That's so brave," Jessica said with exaggerated sympathy. "It's really hard to make it as an entrepreneur these days. Most startups fail within the first year, you know." I knew. I also knew that my company hadn't just survived past the first year, it had thrived. But I said nothing as my father raised his glass in a toast to my son Derek and his accomplished fiancée Victoria, the word accomplished hanging in the air like an indictment of everyone who hadn't earned that particular adjective. Marcus, sitting beside me and introduced to everyone as just a friend, squeezed my hand under the table in silent support. He'd warned me this evening might be difficult, that coming to this celebration might open old wounds I'd worked hard to heal. But I'd come anyway, because some part of me still hoped that maybe this time would be different, that maybe my family would finally see me as something more than their disappointing daughter. I was beginning to realize how foolish that hope had been. The pattern had been set long before this evening, long before Victoria entered our lives with her designer labels and casual cruelty, back when I was 7 years old, and Derek was 9, and I won the regional science fair with a project on solar energy conversion that the judges said was high school level work. My parents hadn't attended because Derek had a baseball game that same afternoon, a game where he sat on the bench for all 9 innings of a mercy rule loss. But they'd been there in the stands cheering while I stood on stage accepting my first place trophy in front of an audience of strangers and teachers who weren't my family. That was the first time I understood that achievement without witness meant nothing to them, that success in their eyes required their presence to validate it, and I was never going to be the child whose events took priority. The pattern continued through middle school, when I qualified for the state math competition, and my mother said she couldn't take time off work, through high school when I was accepted to MIT with a partial scholarship, and my father's first response was to ask how much the remaining tuition would cost him, through my graduation from that same MIT with honors in computer science and engineering, when they attended, but left immediately after the ceremony, because they had dinner reservations back home. Derek's graduation from state 2 years earlier had been an all-day celebration with extended family, a catered backyard party, gifts that included a new laptop and that check for $5,000 to start his adult life right. My graduation gift was a card with $500 and a note that said, "Proud of you," in my mother's handwriting. And I'd sat in my dorm room that night, looking at that card and wondering what I'd have to do to earn the same celebration Derek got for his mediocre 3.1 GPA in business administration. When I was 24 and called home to tell them I was leaving my entry-level position at a software company to start my own firm, my father had actually laughed. Not a chuckle, but a full laugh, and asked me when I planned to get serious about my career, told me that entrepreneurship was for rich kids with trust funds and connections, not for people like us who had to work for a living. My mother had been more gentle but no less discouraging, asking if I was sure I wanted to take such a risk, reminding me that Derek had a steady job with benefits and a 401k, suggesting that maybe I should find a nice stable position and think about settling down because I wasn't getting any younger. I'd started Meridian Tech Solutions, anyway, with $12,000 in savings and a business plan I'd worked on for 8 months. And when I signed my first client 6 months later for a $20,000 contract, I'd called home shaking with excitement, and my father had answered and listened for maybe 30 seconds before cutting me off to tell me that Derek had just been promoted to senior sales associate, and wasn't that wonderful? 3 years ago at Christmas, when Meridian had 15 employees and annual revenue of $8 million, I'd tried again to share my success with them, carefully explaining that my company was growing, that we were hiring, that I'd just signed a major client, and my mother had smiled vaguely and changed the subject to ask when I was going to bring a nice man home to meet them. That was when I'd made the decision to stop trying, to stop seeking their validation, to let them believe whatever they wanted about my life, while I built my empire in silence. And for 5 years that strategy had worked, had protected me from the constant disappointment of their disinterest, until tonight when sitting at this table and watching them celebrate Victoria's accomplishments, while dismissing mine, made me realize that silence hadn't protected me at all. It had only delayed the inevitable reckoning that was now building in my chest like a storm. The appetizers arrived as I returned from that brief walk down memory lane. Pristine white plates with artfully arranged scallops and microgreens that probably cost $40 each. And Victoria was holding court about her career with the confidence of someone who believed she'd earned her position through merit alone, rather than the advantages of family connections and expensive education that had been handed to her. Jessica makes $85,000 at her firm, Victoria announced to the table, as if discussing salaries at a formal dinner was perfectly appropriate behavior. And I just hit $95,000 with my new position, which is really competitive for the Seattle market in marketing roles. She turned to me with that same sharp smile, the one that cut while pretending to be friendly. "Emma, are you making anything from that computer thing yet, or is it still more of a hobby?" Jessica laughed and added, "I mean, it's great that you're trying entrepreneurship, but let's be real, most people who play at having their own business are just unemployed with a website." Amanda, the third member of Victoria's friend group who'd been mostly quiet until now, chimed in with exaggerated sympathy. "My cousin tried to start her own business too, some kind of consulting thing, and she ended up having to move back in with her parents after a year. It's just so hard to make it without a real career foundation, you know?" I felt Marcus tense beside me, his hand gripping his wine glass with enough force that I worried briefly about the stem snapping, but I kept my expression neutral and simply said, "I'm doing fine, thank you for asking." Derek's best man, Chad, who'd arrived late and had apparently been briefed on the family dynamics, decided this was his moment to contribute. "Hey, no shame in the struggle, Emma," he said with the kind of false camaraderie that made my teeth ache. "We all start somewhere. I bet you've got a nice little studio apartment somewhere, probably in one of the up-and-coming neighborhoods, right? Those are great for single people just figuring things out." My father chuckled at that, actually chuckled, and my mother smiled indulgently, as if Chad had said something clever rather than insulting, and I watched my brother say nothing, do nothing, just sit there with his arm around Victoria, like this was all perfectly acceptable dinner conversation. Victoria leaned forward then, her eyes bright with the particular excitement of someone about to share impressive news. Speaking of careers and finances, Derek and I have been planning the wedding, and I'm so excited to tell you all that we've settled on a budget of $100,000. She paused for effect, letting that number hang in the air. My parents are contributing $50,000 for the catering and flowers, which is just incredibly generous. She looked directly at me when she said the amount, her gaze traveling from my simple dress to my minimal jewelry to my face, with an assessment that made her opinion clear. This was an amount I couldn't possibly comprehend, a sum so far beyond my reach that even understanding it was probably difficult for me. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table, 3 short pulses that were our signal, the code we'd developed over years of friendship that meant, I'm here, you're not alone, we can leave whenever you want. And I squeezed back once to acknowledge him, to let him know I was still holding together, even as I watched my family celebrate my brother's engagement to a woman who was actively working to humiliate me in front of everyone I'd known my entire life. The main course arrived with ceremonial precision, servers in crisp uniforms placing perfectly seared fillets and herb-crusted salmon in front of each guest, and Victoria chose that moment to make her announcement with the kind of calculated timing that suggested she'd been waiting for maximum audience attention. I have some exciting news to share, she said, her voice rising above the quiet clatter of silverware, and everyone turned to look at her with expectant smiles. I was promoted last week to Senior Marketing Director at my company, Tech Vision Marketing. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic, my mother reaching across the table to squeeze Victoria's hand, while my father raised his wine glass in a premature toast, and Derek beamed at his fiancée with such obvious pride that I felt something twist in my chest. Not jealousy of their relationship, but rather a deep aching wonder at what it must feel like to have your accomplishments celebrated so readily by the people who were supposed to love you. That's wonderful, Victoria, my mother gushed with more warmth than I'd heard in her voice all evening, certainly more than she'd directed at me in years. Finally, Derek found someone accomplished, someone who really understands what it takes to succeed in the professional world. Victoria accepted the praise with practiced humility that didn't quite hide her satisfaction and continued. The promotion comes with a significant raise. I'm now making $120,000 annually, which feels like I've really made it in the tech world, you know? Jessica clapped and added, That's amazing. And you're at such a great company too. I've heard Tech Vision is one of the best marketing firms in Seattle. And I kept my expression carefully neutral, even as I felt Marcus shift slightly beside me, his attention sharpening because he knew exactly what company Victoria had just named, knew exactly what that meant, and I caught the barest hint of a smile threatening at the corner of his mouth. Speaking of companies, Jessica said, apparently not content to let Victoria have all the spotlight. I should mention I work at DataSync Solutions, we're a data analytics firm, and the tech sector is just so dynamic right now. So many opportunities for people who are serious about their careers. My father seized on this, his face animated in a way it never was when I talked about my work, asking Jessica about her company's structure and growth trajectory, engaging with genuine interest that he'd never once shown in anything I'd tried to share with him. The conversation flowed around me like I was a rock in a stream, present but irrelevant. And then my father stood with his wine glass raised and announced he wanted to make a toast to my successful son and his brilliant soon-to-be daughter-in-law, 2 people who represent everything we hoped our children would become, 2 people who have built real careers and real futures. I wasn't mentioned, not even as an afterthought. Victoria's mother, Helen, who'd been mostly quiet during the earlier mockery, but whose tight smiles suggested she approved of everything her daughter said, chose that moment to offer her own observation with a glance in my direction that made her target clear. You know, Helen said with the kind of false sympathy that was really condescension wearing a mask. Not everyone is cut out for success. Some people are just meant to be support roles in life, and that's perfectly fine. The world needs all types. The words hung in the air like poison, and I watched my mother nod slightly as if Helen had said something wise rather than cruel. Watched my father return to his meal without comment. Watched the whole table accept this assessment of my worth, as if it were simple fact. Derek finally spoke then, and for a moment, I thought he might defend me, might finally stand up for his sister after years of silent complicity. But what he said was somehow worse than nothing. "Come on, everyone. Go easy on Emma. She's trying her best," he said with a patronizing gentleness that suggested I was a child who needed protection rather than an adult who deserved respect. And I felt Marcus's hand find mine under the table, felt his fingers lace through mine with a grip that was both supportive and barely restrained fury, and I squeezed back twice, our signal that meant, "I'm okay, stay calm," even though I wasn't entirely sure I was okay. Wasn't sure how much more of this I could endure before the careful control I'd maintained all evening finally shattered. I excused myself from the table with a murmured comment about needing the restroom, and as I walked away from that carefully arranged tableaus of my family's cruelty, past the other diners with their normal celebrations and ordinary happiness, I felt the weight of 8 years of secrecy pressing against my chest like something physical, something that had mass and substance and needed finally to be released. The restroom was all marble and soft lighting, expensive in the way everything about this restaurant was expensive. And I stood at the sink looking at my reflection and let myself acknowledge what I'd been holding back all evening, the truth that Marcus had been begging me to share for 2 years, the reality that would change everything once I spoke it aloud. I am Emma Chen, founder and CEO of Meridian Tech Solutions, a software company I built from absolutely nothing when I was 24 years old, with $15,000 in savings, a laptop, and a vision for data analytics integration that nobody else in the market was pursuing. The company is now worth $200 million. We have 500 employees across 3 offices in Seattle, San Francisco, and Austin. My personal net worth is $47 million. I have worked 80-hour weeks for 8 years, slept on a couch in my first office for 6 months to save money on rent, taught myself advanced programming languages at 3 in the morning when I couldn't afford to hire developers, pitched to 63 venture capital firms before finding one that would take a chance on a young woman with no business degree and nothing but conviction, and built something extraordinary from the ground up while my family dismissed every single achievement as a cute hobby I would eventually abandon when I came to my senses. Marcus isn't just my date or my friend, though he's both of those things. He's my chief financial officer, the person who joined me when we were just 5 employees working out of a converted warehouse space and who has watched me pour my entire soul into this company while my family couldn't be bothered to ask a single substantive question about what I was building. And here's the detail that has been sitting in my mind all evening. The knowledge that made Marcus's hand squeeze mine under the table when Victoria announced her company name. The fact I discovered 3 months ago when I was reviewing our client contracts and saw 2 familiar names. Tech Vision Marketing, Victoria's employer, pays Meridian Tech Solutions $30,000 monthly for our proprietary analytics and CRM software platform, a contract they've held for 4 years, and Data Sync Solutions, where Jessica works with such pride, pays us $25,000 monthly for similar services. They have no idea who owns the company that provides the software their entire operations depend on, because I made a deliberate choice 8 years ago to keep my face off our public website, to let Sarah Mitchell, my brilliant COO, handle all client-facing meetings while I focused on product development and strategy, to build something real and substantial without my family's knowledge, because I wanted, desperately and probably foolishly, to see if they would ever value me for who I was, rather than what I had. I stood at that marble sink with my hands gripping the cool stone edge and let the memories flood through me, the accumulated weight of 32 years of dismissal and disappointment, starting with that afternoon when I was 16 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with my SAT prep books spread out in front of me and a programming manual I'd checked out from the library. And my father had walked in and asked what I was doing with such intense focus on those computer things. And when I'd explained excitedly that I was teaching myself to code because I wanted to study computer science in college, he'd actually laughed and said, "Emma, sweetheart, you should focus on finding a good husband rather than wasting time with all that technical stuff. Nobody wants to marry a woman who's more interested in machines than people." And I remembered the way those words had felt like a physical blow, even as I'd smiled and nodded and gone back to my books with something hardening in my chest. Then there was my acceptance to MIT, full scholarship for academic excellence, and I'd been so proud when I'd told my parents at dinner that I'd gotten into one of the best engineering schools in the country, and instead of celebration, my mother had gone quiet and then said, "But MIT is so far away, Emma. Why can't you go to state like Derek? Stay close to family. You're abandoning us for some fancy school where you'll just be miserable." And my father had agreed, saying I was being selfish and impractical, and they'd made my greatest achievement feel like a betrayal. I remembered the phone call 6 years ago. I'd been 26 and Meridian had just landed its first major client contract, $100,000 for a year-long software licensing agreement. And I'd been so excited I'd called my father during my lunch break, practically vibrating with the need to share this milestone with someone who was supposed to care. And he'd answered, and I'd rushed through the explanation of what this meant for my company, how this contract validated everything I'd been working toward, and he'd said, "That's nice, honey," in that distant tone that meant he wasn't really listening. And then he'd said, "Actually, I'm glad you called. I wanted to tell you about Derek's promotion to senior sales associate. They're giving him a company car and everything." And he'd spent 20 minutes talking about Derek's moderately successful sales career, while my triumph withered into something small and unimportant. Christmas 3 years ago surfaced in my mind with painful clarity. The family gathered around the dining table, and my mother asking what everyone had been up to. And I'd tried to explain that Meridian had grown to 50 employees, and we'd just opened our second office. And my mother had nodded politely for maybe 30 seconds before turning to Derek and asking about his girlfriend at the time, changing the subject so smoothly it was like I hadn't spoken at all. Standing in that expensive restroom with my reflection staring back at me, I finally let myself fully acknowledge what I'd been avoiding for years. I had been seeking their approval my entire life, measuring my worth by their attention, building an empire partly to prove to them that I mattered, and they would never, ever give me what I needed, because they had decided long ago who I was supposed to be, and my actual achievements didn't fit their narrative. Marcus had warned me 2 days ago when I told him about the engagement party that this might be difficult, that Victoria and her friends would likely be condescending, that my family's patterns wouldn't magically change, and he'd asked me gently why I kept putting myself through this, and I'd said something about hoping things might be different this time, hoping that maybe they'd finally see me. But now standing here with Helen's words about support roles still echoing in my ears, and my mother's declaration that Victoria was the daughter we always wanted, burning in my chest, I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would change unless I forced them to see reality, forced them to confront the truth they'd been too blind or too willfully ignorant to recognize. The decision solidified in my mind, like steel cooling into an unbreakable shape. I was done hiding. I walked back to the table with my spine straight and my head high, that decision I'd made in the restroom burning in my chest like a promise I was finally ready to keep. And as I slid back into my seat, Marcus glanced at me, and I could see him reading something in my expression because his eyebrows raised just slightly. In a question I answered with the smallest nod. Victoria and Jessica were deep in conversation about work, their voices carrying that particular tone of professional complaint that people use when they want to sound important and burdened. And as I settled back into my chair, I caught Victoria saying, "The absolute nightmare clients we have to deal with. I swear the vendors think they can just charge whatever they want because the software is proprietary, And Jessica was nodding enthusiastically in that way that meant she was preparing to jump in with her own story. Don't even get me started on software licensing costs, Victoria continued, reaching for her wine glass with the casual confidence of someone who had no idea she was about to detonate her entire evening. TechVision is spending an absolutely insane amount on this one platform, Meridian Tech, and I've been telling my director for months that whoever runs that company is completely gouging prices, but the software is too good to replace and they know it, so they've basically got us over a barrel. Jessica practically jumped in her seat with recognition and said, "Wait, Meridian Tech Solutions? DataSync uses them too. We've got the same issue. The licensing fees are astronomical, but every time we look into alternatives, nothing else comes close to their analytics integration." And I felt Marcus shift beside me, felt the tension in his posture that meant he was working very hard not to smile or laugh or give away what was coming. I took a sip of my water and asked in my most casual, interested voice, "What exactly does Meridian Tech provide for your companies?" And Victoria turned to me with that familiar, condescending expression, the one that said she was about to explain something complicated to someone she assumed couldn't possibly understand. And she said, "Big business software solutions, Emma. It's pretty technical, basically enterprise-level CRM and analytics platforms that integrate with existing data infrastructure, using that slow, careful tone people use when they think they're talking to a child." "It sounds fascinating," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "How long has TechVision been using their services?" And Victoria launched into what was clearly one of her favorite topics, explaining that they'd been a client for 4 years, that the current contract was being renegotiated, that she actually had a major meeting scheduled with some Meridian representative next week to discuss renewal terms. "The contract is 30,000 monthly," she said, and I watched her enjoy the way that number sounded, the casual mention of such a substantial figure, which is honestly outrageous, but I'm hoping I can negotiate it down during the renewal meeting, show them that TechVision has options. Marcus's hand found mine under the table and squeezed, and I squeezed back, letting him know I was ready, that this was happening, that there was no turning back now. My mother, who had been listening to Victoria with that adoring expression she usually reserved for Derek's accomplishments, asked about the wedding venue, and Victoria lit up even more if that was possible and launched into a detailed description of the Crystal Conservatory, the most exclusive venue in the city, explaining that just the venue rental was $50,000 and that her parents were covering the catering while my parents handled the venue cost. And I sat there listening and waiting and feeling something that wasn't quite anticipation and wasn't quite dread, but was definitely the electric charge of knowing that everything was about to change forever. Derek cleared his throat in that way that meant he was about to make an announcement, and I watched him stand up and reach for Victoria's hand with that broad smile he always got when he was about to ask for something he was confident he would receive. And he said, "So Victoria and I have been talking, and we have a small request for the family." And I felt my stomach tighten because I knew from years of experience that Derek's small requests were never actually small. And sure enough, he launched into an explanation about how they'd been thinking about the wedding and realized they wanted to do something really special, a destination event in Bali just for immediate family, an intimate ceremony on the beach before the big wedding here. And he looked at my parents with that expectant expression and said, "We were hoping you could contribute another 25,000 to make it happen. It would mean so much to both of us." And I watched my parents exchange one of those looks that meant they were absolutely going to say yes before my father even opened his mouth to agree that of course they would cover it, that Derek deserved to have the wedding of his dreams. Then Derek turned to me, and I saw something flicker in his expression, something that might have been discomfort or might have been nothing at all, and he said, "Obviously, just the parents contributing, Emma. We know you can't afford to chip in for something like this." And Victoria actually laughed, that bright tinkling sound that was supposed to seem carefree but always felt calculated, and she said, "Maybe she can make us a nice card or something. That can be her contribution." And her friends erupted in laughter while I sat there feeling that familiar sting, that burn of humiliation that I'd felt so many times before, But this time I held on to the knowledge of what was coming and let that anchor me. My father, emboldened by the laughter, made a joke about how Derek got the business genes in the family, while I apparently got something else he couldn't quite identify, and everyone laughed again except Marcus, whose hand found my knee under the table and squeezed hard. And then my mother reached over and patted Victoria's hand and said with such warmth and pride, "You really are the daughter we always wanted." And I saw Marcus's jaw clench so hard I thought his teeth might crack. I pulled out my phone under the table and texted him just one word, "Now." And he looked at me with a question in his eyes, making sure I was ready. And I nodded once, firmly, and he nodded back. Victoria was still talking, riding high on the attention and approval, explaining her wedding dress that would cost $15,000 from some designer I'd never heard of, and the honeymoon in the Maldives that would run $20,000. And she mentioned casually that with her new promotion and salary, she was hoping to start saving for a house down payment soon, maybe have enough in a few years if she was careful. And I listened to her plan out a financial future that I had already surpassed years ago. And I felt that decision I'd made in the restroom solidify into something unbreakable. I cleared my throat, and the sound cut through Victoria's monologue about honeymoon plans, and I watched heads turn toward me as I said in a voice that was perfectly calm and steady, "Victoria, I'd love to hear more about your new position at Tech Vision Marketing. It sounds like you've accomplished a lot there." And I saw her face light up the way it always did when someone gave her an opportunity to talk about herself, and she launched into an explanation of her role as Senior Marketing Director, describing her responsibilities and her team and the major accounts she managed. And I nodded along and asked questions that were specific enough to make her pause. Questions about their client retention strategies, and their quarterly growth targets, and their software integration challenges. And I watched confusion flicker across her face as she said, "You seem to know a lot about marketing operations. Did you Google Tech Vision or something?" And I smiled and said, "I'm just familiar with how mid-size marketing firms structure their operations, especially ones that rely heavily on proprietary software platforms for their analytics." And she looked slightly uncomfortable now, uncertain whether I was complimenting her or something else. And I leaned forward slightly and said, "Actually, I'm particularly familiar with TechVision's account structure and software dependencies." And she laughed nervously and said, "How would you possibly know about that?" And I let the moment stretch out, let the silence at the table build, felt Marcus beside me radiating tension and anticipation, and then I said very calmly and clearly, "I'm familiar with all my clients." The confusion on Victoria's face deepened and she said, "Your clients? What are you talking about?" And I continued in that same steady voice. Tech Vision Marketing has been a Meridian Tech Solutions client for 4 years now. Your current contract is $30,000 monthly for our proprietary analytics and CRM software platform, the one you were just complaining about as overpriced. And I watched her mouth open and close, and Jessica leaned forward and said, "Wait, what?" And Victoria laughed, but it was a high, uncertain sound, and she said, "Meridian? How would you know anything about their clients?" And I reached into my purse with deliberate slowness, pulled out one of the business cards I always carried but rarely used, and slid it across the table toward Victoria, watching it glide across the white tablecloth until it stopped directly in front of her wine glass. She picked it up, and I watched her eyes focus on the text, watched her read it once and then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. And the card was simple and elegant, cream-colored cardstock with embossed text that read, "Emma Chen, founder and CEO, Meridian Tech Solutions," with my office phone number and email address below. And Jessica leaned over Victoria's shoulder to look, and I heard her sharp intake of breath, and the entire table had gone silent now. Everyone staring at either the card or me or both. And I sat there with my hands folded calmly in my lap and waited for someone to speak, waited for the reality of what they were seeing to penetrate the assumptions they'd been carrying all evening. And Victoria's face had gone from flushed with wine and excitement to pale and shocked, and she looked up at me and said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, This is a joke, right? I let the silence stretch for another moment and watched Victoria's face cycle through confusion and disbelief and the beginning of something that looked like panic. And then I said in that same calm, steady voice, "No, Victoria, this isn't a joke. I founded Meridian Tech Solutions 8 years ago when I was 24 years old. Started it in a one-bedroom apartment with money I'd saved from my first job out of MIT, and I built it from the ground up into what it is today." And I watched my father lean forward with his mouth slightly open and my mother's hand frozen halfway to her wine glass, and I continued. "We now have 500 employees across 3 offices, one here in the city, one in Austin, and one in Boston. Our annual revenue last year was $60 million, and we're projected to hit $75 million this year." And I heard Jessica make a small sound that might have been a gasp or might have been something else. And Victoria was still staring at the business card as if it might transform into something else if she looked at it long enough. And I said, "Victoria, you work for Tech Vision Marketing, which has been one of my clients for 4 years now. Your current contract with Meridian is $30,000 monthly for access to our proprietary analytics platform and CRM integration system. The very software you were complaining about 20 minutes ago is overpriced." And I turned to Jessica and said, "And Jessica, DataSync Solutions, where you work, has been our client for 3 years. Your contract is $25,000 monthly for our data management and client tracking software. I'm familiar with both contracts because I personally review and approve all major accounts, and any contract over $15,000 monthly comes across my desk for final authorization." Derek finally found his voice and said, "Wait, what? Emma, what are you talking about?" And I pulled out my phone with deliberate slowness, opened the browser, navigated to the Meridian Tech Solutions corporate website, and pulled up the leadership page where my professional headshot sat at the top with my full bio underneath listing my education at MIT, my role as founder and CEO, and a brief overview of the company's growth and mission. And I turned the phone so the whole table could see and said, "I don't publicize my role extensively because I prefer to let my Chief Operating Officer, Sarah Mitchell, handle most client relations and public-facing meetings while I focus on product development, strategic planning, and the technical side of the business, but I am absolutely the founder, majority shareholder, and CEO of Meridian Tech Solutions." My father reached across the table and said, "Let me see that," in a voice that was rough and uncertain, and I handed him the phone and watched him stare at the screen, and then look up at me, and then back at the screen, as if he couldn't quite reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the professional biography he was reading. And my mother leaned over his shoulder to look, and I saw her face go pale, and I let them process what they were seeing for a moment before I continued. "The company is currently valued at approximately $200 million based on our last funding round and current market comparables. My personal net worth, including my equity stake in Meridian and my other investments, is $47 million. And I've built all of this over the past 8 years while you've assumed I was struggling or failing or playing at entrepreneurship. And I watched those numbers land on my family like physical blows. Watched Victoria's face drain of what little color had returned to it. Watched Jessica lean back in her chair as if trying to distance herself from her earlier mockery. And I felt Marcus beside me radiating quiet support and satisfaction. And I knew that everything was about to change, that this moment was the fault line between the family I'd had and whatever would come next. And I felt no triumph in it, only a deep, sad relief that the pretending was finally over. Victoria stammered something that sounded like, "This can't be real." And she looked around the table as if searching for someone to confirm that this was all some elaborate prank. And I watched her desperation and felt nothing but a hollow kind of vindication. And I turned to Marcus and said, "Marcus, would you mind introducing yourself properly to my family?" And he straightened in his chair and said in his clear professional voice, "Marcus Kim, Chief Financial Officer of Meridian Tech Solutions. I've held this position for 5 years, and I've worked with Emma since the company had 20 employees, an annual revenue of $2 million. Everything she's told you is completely accurate, and I've been trying to convince her to tell you all the truth for the past 2 years, because I've watched her build something extraordinary while her own family had no idea what she was accomplishing. And he pulled out his own business card and placed it on the table next to mine, and though evidence was now undeniable, two business cards with the same company name and the same elegant logo, and I looked at my father and my mother and my brother, and I felt 8 years of dismissal and hurt and invisible wounds rise up in my throat, and I said in a voice that was steady despite the emotion behind it, "For 8 years I've built this company from absolutely nothing. I started in a one-bedroom apartment with a laptop and a dream and $15,000 I'd saved from my first job after MIT. I worked 80-hour weeks for the first 3 years. I slept on a cot in my office because I couldn't afford both an apartment and office space. I risked everything I had and everything I could borrow, and I built Meridian into what it is today through my own work and my own vision and my own relentless effort." And I watched my father's face change from shock to something that might have been shame, and I continued. "And every single time I tried to share my success with you, every time I tried to tell you that things were going well, or that we'd landed a major client, or that we were expanding, you dismissed me, or ignored me, or changed the subject to talk about Derek." And Derek opened his mouth to say something, but I raised my hand and said, "Let me finish. I need to say this." And he closed his mouth, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding. "Dad, do you remember when I called you 4 years ago, excited because we'd just signed our first $100,000 contract? You were on the phone with me for maybe 30 seconds before you said you had to go because Derek had just texted you about making his quarterly sales quota, and you hung up on me to call him back." And I watched my father's face crumble slightly, and I knew he remembered. And I turned to my mother and said, "Mom, 3 years ago at Christmas, I tried to tell you that I'd just hired my 10th employee and that we were moving into a real office space, and you interrupted me to ask when I was going to stop playing around with computers and settle down and get married like a normal woman, and when I tried to explain that this was my career, you literally changed the subject to talk about Derek's girlfriend at the time." And my mother's eyes were filling with tears, but I couldn't stop now, couldn't let the familiar guilt at causing her pain derail me from finally speaking this truth. And I said to all of them, "You have never once, not one single time in 8 years, asked me how my business was really doing, asked to see the office, asked to meet my employees, showed any genuine interest in what I was building, and now you're sitting here shocked because you've finally been forced to see what you refused to look at all along." I pushed back my chair and stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on me, and I turned to face Victoria directly and said in a voice that was calm and clear and carried across the sudden silence of the restaurant, "Victoria, you and your friends have spent this entire evening mocking my career, mocking my life, mocking my worth as a person. You've made jokes about my appearance and my choices, and whether I can even afford to support myself. And you've done it with such casual cruelty, as if I was so far beneath you that my feelings didn't even matter." And I watched her face flush red and white in alternating waves, and I continued, "You bragged about your salary of $120,000, and I want you to understand something. I pay myself a modest salary of $200,000 annually because I prefer to reinvest most of the profits back into the company. But my equity stake in Meridian Tech Solutions is worth $47 million. So when you were boasting about your income, you were speaking to someone who makes more in investment returns each year than you'll earn in the next decade." And I heard someone at a nearby table gasp because we'd been loud enough that other diners were now openly watching, and I said, "You complained about Meridian's so-called gouging prices, said that whoever runs the company is charging too much. But I want you to understand that our pricing is industry standard. We actually charge less than two of our main competitors for comparable service. And if you genuinely think $30,000 monthly is too expensive for software that runs 70% of your company's operations, then you're welcome to terminate the contract. I'm sure Tech Vision Marketing will love explaining to their clients why their entire CRM system and analytics platform just disappeared. And Victoria opened her mouth, but no sound came out. And I turned to Jessica and said, "Same applies to DataSync Solutions, Jessica. You're paying us $25,000 monthly, and if you think that's unreasonable, you're welcome to build your own data management system from scratch. I'm sure that'll cost less than $300,000 annually." And Jessica looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. And then I turned to my parents and said in a voice that was quieter, but somehow harder, "You're contributing $50,000 to Derek's wedding, and that's generous, it really is. But I want you to understand what that number means to me. I spent $50,000 on new office furniture last month. It was a single line item on our quarterly expenses report. I bought my house for $2.3 million, and I paid cash. I didn't need a mortgage. I didn't need anyone to co-sign. I wrote a check and bought it outright. I drive a Tesla Model S that cost me $90,000. I have investment portfolios worth $8 million in stocks and bonds and real estate. I donate $200,000 annually to scholarships for women in STEM fields. And you never knew any of this because you never asked. You never showed the slightest curiosity about what I was actually doing with my life." And I saw my mother's face crumple and my father's jaw working as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find words. And I felt the truth of everything I was saying settle over the table like a weight, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same, that I had just burned down the fiction of their happy family and built something new in its place, something honest, even if it was painful. My father was the first to try to recover, and he cleared his throat and said in a voice that was trying to sound reasonable but came out shaky, "Emma, sweetheart, why didn't you tell us about all this? If we'd known you were doing so well, we would have been supportive, we would have celebrated with you." And I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest, because even now, even after everything I'd just said, he still didn't understand. And I looked at him directly and said in a voice that was devastatingly calm, "I did tell you, Dad. I told you repeatedly. I called you and emailed you and tried to share my successes with you dozens of times over the past 8 years. And you didn't listen. You didn't ask follow-up questions. You didn't show any interest in the details of what I was building. You assumed I was failing because I didn't fit your narrow image of what success looks like. You didn't care about my company when you thought it was small, and now you're suddenly interested because you've learned it's worth $200 million. And I watched his face flush with shame and something that might have been anger at being called out so publicly, and my mother reached across the table toward me with tears streaming down her face and said, "Emma, please let me touch your hand. Let me try to explain." And I pulled away gently but firmly and said, "Mom, do you know what hurt the most through all of this? It wasn't the mockery, it wasn't the dismissal, it wasn't even the fact that you gave Derek $50,000 for a house down payment and gave me $500 for my birthday that same year. What hurt the most was sitting here tonight and watching you look at Victoria with such pride and affection, watching you pat her hand and call her the daughter you always wanted, watching you say that to her while I sat right here at this table. Because Victoria works for one of my clients, she makes a fraction of what I make, she's accomplished a fraction of what I've accomplished. And you looked at her and saw everything you wanted in a daughter while looking at me and seeing nothing but disappointment." And my mother's face crumpled and she put her hands over her mouth and I heard her sob. And I felt a twinge of guilt because hurting her had never been what I wanted. But I also felt a kind of fierce rightness, because this truth needed to be spoken, it needed to be heard, it needed to be acknowledged, even if it was painful. Derek finally found his voice and said, "Emma, we didn't know. How could we have known if you didn't tell us?" Clearly. And I turned to him and said in a voice that was harder than I'd ever used with him before, "You didn't want to know, Derek, and there's a huge difference between those two things. You never asked about my life. You never visited my office even though I invited you 4 separate times. You never met any of my employees. You never asked to see my business plan or my financial statements or anything that would have shown you what I was actually accomplishing. You were comfortable with me being the family failure because it made you feel better about your own mediocre achievements. And don't try to tell me that's not true because I've watched you for years. I've seen how you positioned yourself as the successful one and positioned me as the one who needed help. And you were so invested in that narrative that you let your fiancée and her friends spend an entire evening humiliating me without saying a single word in my defense until you told everyone to go easy on me because I was trying my best, as if I was some kind of charity case you all needed to be patient with. And Derek's face went pale, and then red, and I could see that my words had hit their mark. And I turned to Victoria, who had been sitting frozen throughout this entire exchange, and said, Victoria, I want to be absolutely clear about something, this situation, everything I've revealed tonight. It doesn't affect your company's contract with Meridian Tech Solutions. My personal feelings don't interfere with my business decisions. And Tech Vision Marketing is a good client that pays on time and uses our software effectively. Your contract is up for renewal next week, and that process will continue exactly as planned. You'll be meeting with my Chief Operating Officer, Sarah Mitchell, and she'll handle the negotiations professionally and fairly. And I watched Victoria's throat move as she swallowed, and she whispered, Thank you. And I nodded and said, But I want you to know that I'll be making sure Sarah is fully briefed on this evening's events. Not because I want to punish you professionally, but because Sarah should understand the context when she sits down with you. And I trust her to handle the situation with the appropriate level of professional distance. I picked up my purse from the back of my chair and pulled out my phone, checking the time even though I didn't care what time it was, and the gesture itself was enough to signal that I was preparing to leave. And my father must have recognized what was happening because he stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and he said in a voice that was louder than it needed to be, Emma, wait. Please, let's not leave things like this. We need to talk about this as a family. And I looked at him and said quietly, calmly, with a steadiness that surprised even me, I don't need your apology right now, Dad. What I need is for you to understand what you've done, what all of you have done. Because for my entire life, for 32 years, you've made me feel worthless. You've made me feel like I was broken or defective or just fundamentally wrong somehow. You celebrated Derek's mediocrity and ignored my excellence. You threw parties for his average achievements and couldn't be bothered to show up for my extraordinary ones. And I have achieved more than anyone in this family. I've built something from nothing. I've created jobs for 500 people. I've created value and innovation and success by any objective measure. And you made me feel like a failure. You made me feel like I was the disappointment, and I need you to sit with that. I need you to understand the weight of what you've done before I can even begin to think about forgiveness. And I saw my mother's face crumple further, and the tears were streaming down her cheeks now, and she was making small gasping sounds. And I felt a twinge of sympathy, because hurting her had never been my goal. But I also felt a fierce certainty that this needed to happen, that this truth needed to be spoken and heard and acknowledged, even if it caused pain. Derek cleared his throat and said in a voice that was trying to sound reasonable, Emma, can we please talk about this privately? This isn't the place for this kind of conversation. And I turned to look at him directly and said with a sharpness that cut through the restaurant's ambient noise, You let your fiancée and her friends humiliate me publicly for an entire evening, Derek. You sat there and said nothing while they mocked my appearance and my career and my life choices. You only spoke up to tell everyone to go easy on me because I was trying my best, as if I was some kind of charity case. So no, we're not taking this private. We're going to address it right here, right now, in front of all the same people who witnessed my humiliation. And I turned to face the wider table, looking at Victoria, who was staring down at her plate, at Jessica, who had gone pale, at the other friends whose names I hadn't even bothered to learn, and I said clearly, I hope you all have a beautiful wedding. I really do. I hope it's everything you've dreamed of. And I'll send a gift because I'm not petty, and I don't believe in punishing Derek for my issues with our parents. But I won't be attending. I won't be standing there smiling and pretending that everything is fine when it's not. I won't be participating in the fiction of our happy family anymore. Derek stood up now too and said, Emma, please, you have to come to the wedding. You're my sister. and I felt something twist in my chest because there was genuine distress in his voice, but I also heard the assumption underneath it, the expectation that I would fold, that I would accommodate, that I would swallow my hurt and show up and play my role, because that's what I'd always done, and I said firmly, I've spent 32 years trying to earn your approval, trying to make you see me, trying to be good enough or smart enough or successful enough to matter to this family. And I'm done. I'm finished with begging for scraps of validation from people who should have loved me unconditionally. I know my worth now, even if you don't, and that has to be enough. Marcus stood beside me, a solid presence at my elbow, and he picked up his own phone and wallet, preparing to leave with me. And I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet and extracted 5 $100 bills, crisp and new, and I placed them deliberately on the table in front of my empty plate and said, "This should more than cover my portion of dinner and drinks." And I watched everyone's eyes fix on the money, $500 laid out like an accusation, and I knew they were all thinking about how casually I'd put that amount down, how it represented what my parents had given me for my birthday when they'd given Derek $50,000 for his house, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone at that table. 3 weeks had passed since the engagement party, and I was sitting in my office on the 32nd floor of Meridian Tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city sprawling out beneath me in every direction, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the streets below, and I was reviewing our quarterly performance reports when Sarah Mitchell, my chief operating officer, knocked on my open door and walked in with a slight smile on her face, and she said, "The Tech Vision contract renewal went through this morning. They signed for another 2 years at the same rate. No issues at all." And I nodded and thanked her because that was good news for the company, even though I felt a strange mix of relief and something I couldn't quite name when I thought about Victoria sitting across from Sarah in our downtown conference room, trying to maintain her professional composure while negotiating with the company that I owned, the company she'd mocked without knowing who ran it. I'd received 17 missed calls from various family members over the past 3 weeks, 12 from my mother, 3 from my father, 2 from Derek, and I hadn't answered any of them because I needed space. I needed time to process everything that had happened and everything I'd said, and I needed to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with them going forward. But this morning something had arrived that I couldn't ignore. A cream-colored envelope addressed in Derek's handwriting, the kind of thick, expensive stationery that Victoria had probably insisted on, and I'd opened it expecting a wedding invitation, or maybe a formal disinvitation. But instead, I found a letter, 3 pages handwritten in my brother's careful script, and he'd written, "Emma, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve the chance to ask. But I need you to know that I've spent the past 3 weeks thinking about everything you said at the engagement party, and you were right about all of it. I was blind and complicit and comfortable with you being cast as the family failure. Because it made my mediocre achievements look better by comparison, I let Victoria and her friends treat you terribly because it was easier than standing up for you. I never asked about your business because I didn't want to know if you were succeeding, and I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed of myself." And reading those words, I felt something crack in the wall of ice I'd built around my heart. Not break completely, but crack enough to let in a thin stream of possibility, and the letter continued. "I know you said you won't attend the wedding, and I understand why. I don't blame you. But I hope that someday, maybe not soon, but someday, you might let me try to be the brother you deserved all along instead of the brother I was." And I set the letter down on my desk and stared out at the city and felt tears prick at my eyes because this was what I'd wanted for so long. Acknowledgement, understanding, genuine remorse. And now that I had it, I didn't know quite what to do with it. My phone rang and I looked at the screen and saw it was my mother. And after 3 weeks of letting her calls go to voicemail, something made me answer. And I said, "Hello, Mom." And I heard her inhale sharply as if she hadn't expected me to pick up, and then she was crying, her voice breaking as she said, "Emma, sweetheart, thank you for answering. I've been calling and I thought you might never speak to me again." And I waited, letting her compose herself, and she continued, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. A lot of reflecting on how I treated you, how we all treated you. And I was wrong, Emma. I was so wrong. I was focused on traditional markers of success. The kind of success I understood, marriage and stable corporate jobs and the appearance of achievement. And I couldn't see what you were building because it didn't fit the template I had in my mind. And I dismissed you and diminished you and made you feel worthless when you were accomplishing extraordinary things. And I felt my throat tighten because these were words I'd needed to hear for years, for decades. And she said, I know I can't undo the damage I've caused. I know an apology doesn't erase 32 years of making you feel less than. But I'm asking if you would be willing to meet me for lunch, just the two of us, so I can try to begin to understand who you really are instead of who I decided you should be. And I closed my eyes and thought about everything that had brought us to this moment. All the pain and dismissal and accumulated hurt, and I said carefully, I'll think about it, Mom. I'm not ready to promise anything right now, but I'll think about it. And she said, That's more than I deserve. Thank you, Emma. Thank you. And we ended the call, and I sat in the silence of my office feeling drained and raw and somehow lighter than I'd felt in weeks.